All right, here we go for part 2 of this first chapter. The first part of the chapter, we introduced the macro and micronutrients. Well, now, the rest of this chapter, we're going to be talking about some nutritional guidelines. I'm going to move a little more quickly here, but as always, I'm going to point out what's most important. And you have the ability to go back and replay, pause, do what you need to do. So when we talk about recommendations, we know that we need carbs, fat, protein, vitamins, minerals, water. Well, how do we know what to eat, how much of each? So we have a set of guidelines called the Dietary Reference Intakes. That is not a very sexy thing, is it? Ha. So I put in red what you need to know. These are a set of guidelines. Okay, fine. We're talking about guidelines for US and Canada, so not necessarily international, although, let's face it, all human needs are pretty similar. These are meant to serve as a baseline for a healthy person, and they're updated every 5 years. This is an interesting thing. You don't need to know it, but if we look at certain governmental programs like WIC, for example, they're going to use these guidelines to help them craft their programs, which is interesting. But I bring all this up because these are legitimate guidelines. They're not just made out of a whim. They're not made by food companies. If they were made by food companies, we would have a lot more, Captain Crunch, I suppose. But these are legitimate. It's made by a scientific governing body. They're updated. So they're actually pretty good, okay? I've given you a list, excuse me, but the only ones that you're going to need to know are the ones that I have starred, the RDAs, the upper intake levels, and then our energy recommendations, okay? When I put this together, I recently redid this. As I said, these guidelines change or updated every 5 years. So when I went back to redo this the last time, I was interested in how these started. You don't need to know these for the test, but I just thought it was interesting. I don't know. They were basically released around World War II time, right? Which is kind of sad, but that was certainly a time when we needed to make sure that the troops on the ground, the troops in the air had what they needed. So that's where it came from. And you can see, and then I went down a rabbit hole. I don't know if you did the same thing. Look at these pictures, man. Whew, look at those sea rations. Would you want to eat what's in that aluminum tin? It kind of looks like throw up. But I guess if I had nothing else to eat, I probably would eat it. And then apparently they had the K rations, which were a little bit fancier. All right. Okay. So I'm going to tell you exactly what you need to know. Now, you don't need to know the EAR. I know I have things in red. You don't need to know it. This began as a way to estimate how much of each food is required. It was meant to be suitable for large populations, and these guidelines for how much of each food is required were meant to meet 50% of the individuals. But that's not good enough, okay? So that's why you don't need to know this. The value of this recommendation was that it was a starting point. Okay, if you want to get all fancy, this first one only met the needs of about 50% of individuals. So not good enough. So it was a starting point. They took this estimated average requirement, and here's what you really want to know: the recommended dietary allowance. Maybe you've heard of that RDA. So what they did is they took those previous recommendations. They took the first ones and they purposely set them higher. So we did all this research on the needs of people for each nutrient, each food, and we purposely set those recommendations a little bit higher. And that way, it's not going to meet just 50% of the population's needs. It's going to meet 97 to 98% of the population needs. So here's the first one you need to know, RDAs. These are recommendations on how much of each food we need. It's based on the initial, but it's set higher. And because of that, if we purposely set the guidelines a little bit higher, we're going to be sure that you meet nearly the recommendations for nearly all people. And we're talking about healthy food here for the most part, folks. We're not talking about Oreos and fried chicken. It's okay to set it higher. Ultimately, what would be more of a problem is if we're deficient in something, so we purposely set a little bit higher. Okay, I've got a side-by-side comparison. The one that I'd like you to know is this one. So it's a guideline on how much of each food is needed. It was purposely set higher than the original one. And because we purposely set them higher, it meets the needs of almost everyone. And this is best to be used for individuals instead of large populations. Now, I'm not going to ask you to memorize any of the RDAs. Here are some examples. I took this right from the NIH website, National Institute of Health. The RDAs are not starred, so I just happened to pick magnesium. They will give RDAs for all sorts of foods and nutrients, but here's just an example. And what they even do nowadays is they break it up into age, gender, situation, pregnancy. So, I fit into this category. So based on that, the RDA for magnesium for me is 320 milligrams per day. So it's a guideline for how much of a food or nutrient is needed. Okay. The second one, but one that you don't need to know, I guess it's the third one, adequate intake. We can only do those RDAs, how much of each food, when we have enough information on certain nutrients. But there's going to be some foods out there or nutrients that we don't have as much scientific evidence. So for that, there's a lower level of scientific certainty, and that recommendation would be the adequate intake. You don't need to know this one. You don't need to know this one. I'm just saying it exists. I do give you a chart here. This is the same chart, but here they're starred. So for example, fluoride. We just don't have as much information about fluoride, so we can't say with as much certainty that the recommended dietary allowance is a certain amount. So it's a lower level of certainty. Hopefully it's a ballpark. Don't need to know that one. What I would like you to know, so the ones you had to know so far were the RDAs, recommended dietary allowance, how much of a certain food or nutrient meets the needs of most people, purposely set higher. Now we're doing the upper limit, tolerable upper intake level. This is the highest amount of a nutrient that can be consumed without harm. I mean, the word kind of gives it away, or the title, upper limit. So it actually is the case that if we bring in too much of certain things, it can actually be toxic. And we tend to be talking about vitamins and minerals. We'll talk about this more later, but did you know you can have toxicity? Even something like vitamin C, which we know is good, but there's actually a point where you can bring in too much and it can actually be harmful. Let's look at vitamin C. Again, I'm not going to ask you any specifics. I just included these just so you know that they exist. So I'd look at myself again. So for me, the upper limit of what's safe for me to bring in per day is up to, but not exceeding, 2,000 milligrams of vitamin C per day. That's the upper limit. I could ingest up to 2,000 milligrams of vitamin C without harm. If I ingest more than that per day, I'm at risk for toxicity. We'll talk about this more later, but it's a real thing. Okay. So the ones that you've needed to know so far would be the recommended dietary allowance, how much of a certain food is needed or nutrient, set a little bit higher on purpose to meet the needs of most everyone, and then the tolerable upper limit. That's the upper limit of what we can ingest before something becomes toxic. Well, now we're going to talk about energy needs. And for that, let's start with this one, acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges. Now, it just so happens we've already talked about it. So I don't need to go through it because you already know it. You've already been studying carbohydrates. What percentage of our daily diet and calories should come from carbs? Somewhere between 45 and 65%. What percentage of our calories should come from fat? 20 to 35%. From protein, 10 to 35%. We're going to address the total amount of calories a little bit later. But for now, it's just those three. I put the slide twice because it's so important. And here's the chart from the NIH. I'm not lying to you, folks. Now, in total, we've talked about three you had to know. I'm going to do it again. See the repetition? RDAs. How much of a food or nutrient is needed, purposely set higher, meets the needs of most people. Upper limit. The highest amount of something we can consume without toxicity or harm. And then the AMDRs would be the percentages of each carbs, fat, and protein that should come. The percentages of our total calories that should come from carbs, fat, and protein. Okay. I mentioned this before, but why do we give this in a range? What was our range of carbohydrates? Somewhere between 45 and 65%. Why is it a range? Because they might be different based on a person. A marathon runner needs more carbohydrates. So maybe they'd be at the max of that percentage. A couch potato needs less. Right? I'm just giving you examples. And there's not necessarily one right or wrong. You could have two people, same age, height, weight, activity level, but their bodies could be a little bit different. So this range also gives us some room for individuality. A diabetic, they want to have less sugar and less fat. A weightlifter in particular is going to need a lot of protein. And these percentages reflect that. Okay, there are some online tools that are available to you if you want. Now, a little bit later, we're going to be looking at nutrition labels. Do the DRIs, the RDA, upper limits, and AMDRs, are they related to what's on the nutrition label? Kind of. On the nutrition label, which we're going to talk about later this chapter, you'll see that the values are given as a percentage of daily value. So they use a different terminology, which is kind of weird. So they give recommendations based off of percent daily value. It's not the same thing, but they're based on the RDA. So even though the wording's a little bit different, what's on a nutrition label, percent daily value, is related to the RDAs. Not exactly the same, but they're related. All right? Okay. The only three you need to know: RDA, upper limit, AMDR. Okay? Now remember, these were meant for healthy people. So if someone has a certain condition, illness, pregnancy, this could be a condition, training for a marathon, genetic situation, they might be a little bit different. But it gives us a ballpark for a healthy individual. And please, come on. It's not that we're going to meet them every day, always the same. So we understand that we're not going to meet them all the time, and that's okay. That'd be really boring, by the way, wouldn't it? So it's okay to be a little bit higher in one, lower in the other. But over the course of weeks and months, years, are we getting close to these recommendations? That's really what we want to be doing, is trying to do that. Okay, so other ways that we can look at guidelines. So we just talked about some guidelines set by a governing body, right? The RDA, upper limit, AMDR. Well, there's other ways that we can get help to try and understand what our diet should consist of. This is a different set of guidelines from a different governing body with a different purpose. It's not as specific, right? The RDAs, the upper limits, they're very specific. These are more guidelines for how to apply them. So we're going to talk about the dietary guidelines for America and MyPlate. So let's start with this, dietary guidelines. So I think we're actually going to be seeing the 2025 to 2030 soon. These are guidelines set for Americans. They are based on research. They are also used for a basis in policy. Okay? What do the dietary guidelines say? I mean, it's kind of common sense. So please don't spend a whole lot of time memorizing this. Just understand that these are some general guidelines. We want to have an eating pattern that accommodates every life stage. And these are new. Like, what is this one? 20 to 25? Even the ones from 2015 to 2020 didn't have that. So you can see that we're learning and these guidelines are changing a little bit. The guidelines say that we should be having foods that meet preferences, cultural traditions, budget. We want to have high nutrient-dense food. We want to stay within a calorie limit. We want to limit things that we know are not good. So folks, you don't need to memorize that. And they give you a little handy tool. Look, follow a diet at every life stage. Customize it based on your personal preferences. Limit things that are high sugar like soda, blah, 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 blah. They're kind of simple, right? But still good reminders. What I want to spend a little bit more time on is MyPlate. It's a similar idea, but it's a visual representation. Okay. Now, we've gone through a whole bunch of different iterations. When I was a kid, I know I'm old now. When I was a kid, it was the 4 food groups. Then it was the food guide pyramid. Well, now it's MyPlate, right? So this is the most current visual representation, MyPlate. Now, it's easy to say, oh, isn't this hokey, 4 food groups, blah, 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 blah. Kind of. But you know what? It's still a guideline. If we didn't have traffic signals, look at that intersection, folks. It still gives us a roadmap. So please don't discount it, okay? It's based off of research. We're not going to be perfect, but it's meant to be a guideline, and it can actually help. So what does MyPlate say? MyPlate says that every plate, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, half of your plate should be fruits and veggies. Now, isn't that a humdinger? Is half of your plate fruits and veggies? Ha! The remaining half, a quarter grains, a quarter protein. So a quarter grains, a quarter protein. Those are what I'd like you to know. The MyPlate guidelines tell us that to help us meet the needs, a visual representation could be that half of our plate should be fruits and veggies, the other half, a quarter protein, a quarter grains. As an aside, they say 1 serving of dairy, add some margarine or oil at food prep, blah, blah, blah. Now, how many of us do you think meet that, right? Probably not very many of us. I happen to be a vegetarian, so I eat a lot of vegetables, but do I have half my plate? Probably on many meals, yes, but not all. What's more common in our country for the grains and the protein to be overtaking everything? All right. They do provide a bunch of other recommendations. All I would like you to know are the ones, half the plate should be fruits and veggies, the other half, a quarter grains, a quarter protein. They give additional recommendations of the fruits and veggies. It's best to have multiple colors because we are guaranteed to have multiple vitamins and minerals. What's interesting is, and I would like you to know this, MyPlate says, if you actually meet this on most days, you're actually going to have calories left over. You're going to have met your nutrient needs. You're going to have met your nutrient needs without exceeding your calories, which means that we should have some discretionary. And that's where we can have some fun. So they do allow, if you actually eat well, you have some discretionary calories to play with. According to MyPlate, it says not more than 15% should come from that. Okay. There's an app for this now. Boy, have things changed. They give you some sample recipes. You can actually go on to the MyPlate Plan website and you can put in your age, height, weight, activity level, and it'll spit out at you some general recommendations. There's really no lack of information out there. Okay, I've put some other information, these are from old textbooks that used to give you ideas for what healthy meals can look like. Take it or leave it, just some examples. Is it perfect? No. Here are some tips on how to make more healthful choices. If you're looking for a list, I really can't think of a lot of lean proteins. Well, here's a list. If you want to, what are some healthy fats? Look. So some of these, I hope some of these can actually be helpful to you. All right. Now, we just talked about MyPlate being the new government visual guideline. The food guide pyramid has kind of gone away, right? But I still want to point out, years and years ago, probably around 2010, the Swiss, so it's right there, Swiss Forum for Sports Nutrition, blah, 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 came up with an athlete food guide pyramid. So I'm not going to ask you to know all the details, but it's still a somewhat useful tool. How can we take those general recommendations and maybe adapt them for an athlete? So here was the 2010 version. It was a food guide pyramid. Other more recent versions. So here's what we just talked about with MyPlate. And then here are some athlete food guide pyramids. I just want to have a look at what are some of the things that are different. Let me use bright orange. Okay. What are some things that are different in this sports nutrition or this athlete food guide pyramid? They talk about prioritizing things that should be more or less. They talk about hydration. They do, but they talk about nutrient timing. That would be really important for an athlete. It's important to time a certain carbohydrate or whatever based off of your activity, right? They talk about supplements. So I just want to include this. And I also want to point out, folks, supplements are at the very top, meaning the smallest priority. What is the biggest priority? High quality foods. I actually am not a fan of supplements. In fact, the word supplement means that it should only be supplemented when you can't get it through your normal diet. So we should always be trying to get things through our normal diet first. You don't need to know the specifics. I'm just putting it out there for you. Okay, we're going to end this chapter with some random little pieces. I'm going to move quickly. You just need to know what I circle or put in red. Serving sizes. We know they've changed. I'm going to have you know just a couple. One official serving size for protein, 3 ounces. Cooked vegetables and pasta, 1/2 cup. Fruit, medium in size, like a baseball. One example of a dairy would be 1 ounce of cheese, which is probably less than you thought. If we want to put that into practice, I said meat is 3 ounces. That's about the size of a deck of cards or the palm of your hand. Pasta, 1/2 cup, usually about your fist. One serving of fats would be like 1 ounce of cheese. That's basically the size of your thumb. You only need to know these. Now, it's okay to have more than one serving size sometimes. If you go out to a restaurant, if you go to a steakhouse, what's the smallest steak you can get? 8 ounce, maybe a 6 ounce filet mignon. Certainly the other steaks, 12 ounces. So we might bring in more than one serving size, but you just have to know that. Oh my God, I had a 12 ounce steak, so that's really 3 or 4 times a normal serving size. Maybe I should lessen up the protein in my other meals throughout the day. They've changed over time, which is correlated with other health problems and increases in obesity. It used to be that a serving size is what you'd get in the package, but now, you got to be careful. I have that big candy bar. That's probably 2.5 servings. Just things to think about. When we go out, we usually have much more. I really like these comparisons. 3 ounces of protein, like a deck of carbs. You're not going to get that when you go out. A half cup of pasta is not much. I certainly eat more than that. So it's okay sometimes, but just consider. All right. The question we haven't answered yet is, how many calories should you be taking in? How do we know? There's not one right answer. Everyone's a little bit different. Let's just talk about some guidelines. A quick way to think about it. Take your weight in pounds and multiply by 100. Take your body weight in pounds, multiply it by 10. What's wrong with me? Not 100, 10. I will go in and change that. If I'm 150 pounds, I multiply that by 10, which is basically add a 0. I need around 1,500 calories just for basal metabolic needs, which is what your body needs at rest, just to keep your body functioning. Any activity beyond that, even just walking around, certainly exercising, we're going to add. But a quick and dirty way, take your body weight in pounds, multiply it by 10. That's an estimate of how many calories we need just to keep our body going at rest. That's a quick and dirty way to do it. A more specific way that we're going to be doing later is through a formula, the EER, Estimated Energy Requirement. And what you're going to see is, right, we're adults. It's by gender. That will be mine. What does it take into consideration? Age, physical activity, weight, and height. So it's a more specific estimate. Now, if I do this, I'm probably going to get somewhere around probably 2,000 calories. If I'm 150 pounds, my basal metabolic needs is 1,500. When I add in physical activity, it's going to go up. And this is going to be more specialized. So we're going to use a formula to give us a more specific idea. Back in the day, there used to be charts. You don't need to know this, but it's just interesting. Here's an old chart based off of activity and gender. We tend to rely more on the formulas, and that's what websites do, by the way. These are just approximations. Everybody's different. But it gives us a ballpark, okay? All right, I want to briefly talk about food labels. Every packaged food item must have a label. When we say packaged, if you think about the layout of a grocery store, think about the food in the aisles, the packaged food in the aisles. This is what we're thinking of when we talk about these food label guidelines. When you think about what's on the perimeter, think about the fruit, the produce, fruit and vegetables. They're not going to have a label on them. You're not going to put a label on every apple. Bakery items or things from the meat counter. So on the perimeter, we may have some things that aren't included in these label guidelines. These are meant for packaged food in the aisles. What are some of the exemptions? Well, fruits and veggies. So think about things on the perimeter of the grocery store. Some of the things that are interested would be deli items or spices or bulk. If you go to those bulk containers and get some granola or nuts or coffee. For most of these, however, even though they're exempted from having the specific label, they are required to have the information either posted or available upon request. So if you really want to know, you should be able to go to someone at the grocery store and say, I'd like to see the nutritional information for this asparagus. All right, here's our new label. Most recently updated in 2016. Please don't be intimidated, not so bad. It has the total calories for that food item, and these are per serving. But then it will tell you how many servings are in that container, and what a serving size is. So we have to practice how to read this. If I have only one serving of this frozen lasagna, because that's what this came from. If I have only one serving, I'm ingesting 280 calories. One serving is 1 cup. What if I have 2 cups? Then I need to double that. If I have the whole package, how many servings? 4 times 4. So I would take 280 times 4. It then gives us a basic breakdown of the percentages of daily value, which are based off of the RDAs, for the macronutrients: fat, carbohydrate, and protein. It will include some micronutrients. What I want to point out, these percentages are based off of a 2,000 calorie diet. So these percentages are not necessarily going to apply to you. If you happen to need about 2,000 calories, they apply to you. What if you need less? They'll be lower. What if you need more? They'll be higher. So I wouldn't focus as much on the percentages. It gives you an idea, but remember, it's based off of a 2,000 calorie diet. Sometimes we'll see a dual column where they'll have one column where it's the calories and nutrients per serving, and then a second column for the whole container, which is helpful. How many of us eat the whole container? Don't lie. I do too. You may not know this. In addition to the label, now this is an old nutrition label. It looks a little bit different than the new one, but this is about the ingredient list. So in addition to the label, all these packaged items must have an ingredient list. Did you know what's listed first is present in the highest amounts, and then it goes down. What's present least is last. So look at this, LA Light bars, light. That gives you the indication it must be good for you. Well, look what the first ingredient is. Caramel. What's caramel? Sugar. What's the second? A coating made up of sugar. What do we have next? I can't read where that coating ends. Oh yeah, soy nuggets. Oh dear. Cocoa. So that's interesting, right? What's listed first is present in highest amounts, and then it goes down. So I'm going to ask you to practice. The answers are at the end of this presentation. Here's a sample nutrition label for macaroni and cheese. I picked this on purpose. I know when I was in college, I certainly had some macaroni and cheese. Let's say you fixed a whole box. How many kilocalories did you ingest in total? And I don't know why the formatting. What nutrient was present in highest amounts? How many total grams of carbs, fat, and protein? Would you say there's more healthy fats or unhealthy fats? And then what percentage would it take if you needed 4,000 calories a day? I want you to practice. So if you had a whole box, right, it gives you the amount per serving. And notice it's a whole box prepared. I want to make sure I give you all the intro that you need. So a whole box prepared. So a serving size, 2.5 ounces, but it makes about 1 cup. So 1 serving is 1 cup. So I want to read this, per 1 cup prepared. Because the dry mix isn't everything. Don't you have to add some milk? So I want you to read the per 1 cup prepared. And that's 1 serving. How many servings in the whole box? 3. So you got to take those numbers and multiply it by 3. Here's another example. Next morning you have some Cheerios. You make 1.5 cups. What's the serving size? 1 cup. Let's say you have 1.5 cups. And then you add a 1/2 cup of milk. How many total calories? Do you think this has more or less sugar than others? What percentage of total fat? And then is it more or less nutrient dense than the macaroni and cheese? So answers at the end. Please stop this and practice. Our last comparison example, We compare whole milk to 2% to skim. This is, again, the older version of the label, but it's a nice comparison. How much lower in total fat is the 2% compared to the whole? So answer these questions for practice. Okay. I'm going to take a minute here to pause. I feel like I need a little break, which means you must definitely need a break. We're going to come back and finish this chapter and then give the answers to the label. All right, see you for the third one. Please practice those labels.